On May 19, 1565, the southern coast of Malta witnessed a historic confrontation as 40,000 Ottoman soldiers landed to conquer the island. 3 key points. Impossible odds. Facing the Ottomans were only 500 knights and 6,000 soldiers. Yet, it wasn't just about numbers, it was about the will to fight and survive. Strategic preparation. Grandmaster Jean Parisot de la Valette meticulously prepared for this moment for 8 years, turning Malta's geography into a formidable defense. Unyielding defense. Through 4 months of relentless bombardment, assaults, and attrition, the defenders held their ground, demonstrating an unbreakable spirit and strategic discipline. Discover the epic tale of resilience and the indomitable human spirit at the heart of Malta's history. Join us in exploring how 500 knights stood firm against 40,000, shaping the future of Europe and the Mediterranean. Visit our website to dive deeper into this extraordinary story of courage and preparation. They came out of the sea at first light, not all at once. The landing at Marsa began with the advance parties, the scouts and the engineers who went ashore first to secure the beach and report on the ground inland, and then the soldiers came in waves behind them, stepping off the galleys into the shallow water of the bay and wading ashore with their weapons held above their heads, and then more galleys and more, until the bay was full of ships and the beach was full of men, and the plain south of the Grand Harbor was filling with the organized geometry of an army making camp. By noon, 25,000 soldiers were ashore. By evening, the number was closer to 30,000. The remaining 10,000 landed over the following days, bringing the total to 40,000 men and 200 galleys, the largest Ottoman military expedition to the western Mediterranean in a generation. On the high ground above the harbor, watching the landing from behind the limestone walls of Fort St. Angelo, Jean Parisot de la Valette counted what he could see and calculated what he could not. He had been counting for weeks, since the intelligence from Constantinople had made the expedition's destination specific rather than probable. He was 69 years old, and he had spent the previous 8 years turning the island of Malta into something that 40,000 men could not take in a season. And now, 40,000 men were here to prove him right, or wrong. He had approximately 500 knights of the Order of St. John, men who had taken vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, and who had converted those vows into a specific military identity. Men who had trained for warfare since adolescence, and who believed, with the specific faith of soldiers who have been given a religious framework for their profession, that what they were about to do was sanctified. 500 knights, and behind them 6,000 soldiers of various descriptions, Spanish and Italian professionals, Greek and Sicilian volunteers, Maltese militia who had never loved the knights who governed their island, but who understood, with the clarity of people who remember 1551, when Dragut stripped the island of Gozo of its entire population in a single raid, what the alternative was. 6,500 men against 40,000. But the mathematics of this siege were never simply about the numbers. They were about what the men holding the walls were willing to do, and what the men assaulting those walls were willing to lose, and how long the second group could sustain losses before the arithmetic of attrition reversed in ways that no one at the beginning of the campaign had planned for. This siege changed the Ottoman Empire's relationship with Western Europe forever. It was the moment the empire's westward expansion found the wall it could not break. Not a wall of stone, though the walls were real, but a wall of will, of the specific human stubbornness that the Order of St. John had been cultivating for 400 years, and that no one, not even the men who possessed it, fully understood, until it was tested against 40,000 of the finest soldiers in the 16th century world. The Ottomans came to Malta expecting to add it to an empire that had not stopped expanding in 100 years. What they found was the one thing the empire's expansion had not yet encountered: men who would not stop. The empire that would not stop, and the order that did not move. The Ottoman Empire in 1565 was the most powerful political entity in the world. This is not hyperbole, and not the partisan language of Christian or Muslim chroniclers trying to impress their readers with the scale of the conflict. It is the sober assessment of an imperial structure that controlled more territory, commanded more revenue, and projected more military force across more directions simultaneously than any other state in the 16th century. It had taken Constantinople in 1453 and made it the capital of a new Roman Empire under the Crescent banner. It had swept through the Balkans and reduced Hungary to a tributary. It had beaten every Persian dynasty that challenged it in the east. Its navy had made the eastern Mediterranean an Ottoman lake and had extended Ottoman naval power into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Its administrative system, the Devshirme, the Timar, the Millet, had processed and incorporated the diverse populations of a vast multi-ethnic empire into a functioning state with a sophistication that the contemporary European kingdoms could not match. Suleiman I, Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman the Lawgiver, the 10th Ottoman Sultan and the longest reigning, had been on the throne since 1520 and had spent 45 years adding to the empire his father had given him. He had taken Belgrade in 1521 and Rhodes in 1522. He had crushed the Hungarian army at Mohacs in 1526 and installed an Ottoman client on the Hungarian throne. He had besieged Vienna twice, in 1529 and 1532, and if the siege of 1529 had not been interrupted by the early arrival of autumn and the consequent difficulty of maintaining a siege train across the Balkans in October, Vienna might have fallen, and the Habsburg claim to the Holy Roman Empire might have crumbled with it. He had reorganized the Ottoman legal code so thoroughly that his people called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, before they called him anything else. He was 71 years old in 1565, and his face in the portraits that survive shows the specific quality of a man who has been powerful for a very long time, and who regards the world with the patience that comes from knowing that patience, in his position, is a form of force. He did not come to Malta. He sent his commanders and his army and his fleet, and his specific instruction that Malta was to be taken. And he remained at Edirne and waited for the news that would arrive in late summer or autumn, confirming that the island had fallen and that the Mediterranean had become fully Ottoman from one end to the other. He waited for news that never came in the form he expected. The immediate cause of the 1565 expedition was a provocation that Suleiman had chosen to treat as the final straw after decades of accumulating irritation. The knight Romaguz, Mathurin d'Odelescu, called Romaguz, the most celebrated corsair commander in the order's service, had intercepted Ottoman merchant ships in 1564 that had the particular misfortune of being connected to the personal property and interests of several highly placed people in Suleiman's court. The ships were taken. The property was confiscated. The message sent by this specific act to the Ottoman court was the message that 40 years of Maltese corsair activity had been sending in aggregate, but had never before sent so personally. The Knights of Malta were an ongoing affront that the world's most powerful empire had been tolerating, and the tolerance was over. But the deeper cause was strategic, and had been strategic since 1530, when Charles V gave the Knights their island. Malta sat in the center of the Mediterranean at the precise point where the sea narrows between Sicily and the North African coast, the passage through which all east-west maritime traffic must go. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the central Mediterranean corridor. An Ottoman Malta meant Ottoman ability to project naval power westward into the sea lanes of the Spanish Empire, meant an Ottoman base from which Sicily and Naples could be threatened, meant the completion of the Mediterranean's conversion from a contested sea to an Ottoman lake. Suleiman understood this. So did Philip II of Spain, who was the Knights' nominal overlord and who was watching the preparations in Constantinople through his intelligence network, and who was calculating, throughout the spring and summer of 1565, what the fleet's safety was worth against the strategic cost of Malta's fall. The Ottoman commanders sent to accomplish what Suleiman required were men of genuine quality, which is why their failure is so instructive. Lala Mustafa Pasha commanded the land forces, an experienced soldier with a record of successful campaigns, a man who understood siege warfare and who had the specific quality of a field commander who can maintain operational focus through the reversals and frustrations that a long siege produces. He was not a failure. He was a good general who was given an impossible task disguised as a manageable one, and who discovered the impossibility over the course of 4 months in the summer heat of Malta. He had served Suleiman for decades. He had won campaigns in Persia and in the Balkans and in the Eastern Mediterranean. He arrived at Malta with the professional confidence of a man who has executed siege operations successfully before, and who has been given a force large enough, he believes, to execute one more. He was wrong about one thing. He was wrong about what the fort would cost. Piale Pasha commanded the fleet, the hero of Jerba, where he had destroyed a combined Spanish-Italian naval force in 1560 in the most significant Ottoman naval victory of the decade. He was confident and competent, and he had the specific strategic insistence of a naval commander whose primary concern was the safety of the 200 galleys whose loss would transform this campaign from a military failure into a catastrophe. He needed Marsamachetto Harbor, and the entrance to Marsamachetto was commanded by Fort St. Elmo, and St. Elmo had to fall before the fleet could be secured. His insistence on this point, over Mustafa Pasha's preference for a direct assault on Birgu and Sanglia, produced the strategic disagreement that shaped the campaign's character from its first week. Between these two men, and because of their disagreement, Fort St. Elmo received the first assault. It would take 31 days to fall. It would cost 6,000 Ottoman soldiers. And those 31 days, and those 6,000 dead, would establish the specific dynamic of the entire campaign, that Malta was going to cost more than the plan had calculated, and that the gap between the plan's cost and the actual cost would grow with every passing week. Dragut Turgut Reis, the Corsair admiral who had spent decades making the Western Mediterranean unsafe for Christian shipping, arrived late and died early. He came to Malta opposing the decision to attack St. Elmo first, told Mustafa Pasha that attacking the subsidiary fort before the main position was a waste of blood, and then walked into the forward trenches to make the best of a decision he could not reverse. He had been raiding the Maltese coast since the 1550s. He knew the island's terrain better than any other Ottoman commander. He had been to this island before, had attacked it with Sinan Pasha in 1551, and had found it not worth the cost of a sustained assault, and had sailed to Gozo instead, and stripped the island's entire population into slavery in a single day, and then moved on to Tripoli. He had a specific, informed, experienced assessment of what Malta would cost to take that differed from the optimistic assessment that the campaign's planning had produced. He was struck by a fragment from an Ottoman gun on June 17th, directing artillery fire from the forward positions, and died 5 days later on the same morning that Fort St. Elmo fell. The timing was remarked upon by both Christian and Ottoman sources, and both traditions found meaning in it. For the Christians, the death of the greatest Corsair commander in the Mediterranean on the day his predicted outcome was confirmed was evidence of providence. For the Ottomans, the loss of the campaign's best tactical mind at the moment of its first significant success was evidence of the specific cruelty that fate reserves for important moments. Against these men, and behind these walls, stood La Valette, who is best understood not through the usual language of military heroism, but through the specific language of preparation. He was not a brilliant improviser. He was not a man of dramatic gestures or memorable speeches. He was a man who had spent 8 years thinking about this specific problem, and who had converted that thinking into limestone and iron and the specific organizational discipline of 500 knights who had been told, in language that left nothing ambiguous, what the summer of 1565 would require from them. He had been a knight for 50 years. He had been enslaved by Ottoman corsairs in 1541, captured, chained to an oar, rode for a year in the specific hell of a galley slave's existence, ransomed, and returned to service. He had come back from that year without apparent modification of either his purpose or his temperament. He understood the Ottoman military system from the inside, having spent a year inside it, and this understanding shaped his tactical choices throughout the siege in ways that were not always visible, but that were consistently correct. He knew how the Janissaries attacked. He knew how the Ottoman artillery operated. He knew from direct experience what the empire's methods looked like when applied to human beings at close range. He had been elected Grandmaster in 1557 and had used the 8 years since to prepare for the morning of May 19, 1565, as methodically as a man can prepare for the thing he has spent his career expecting. He was right about most things. He was about to demonstrate it. Walls, water, and the arithmetic of endurance. The geography of the knight's defensive position on Malta is the geography of a military problem that had been solved, imperfectly but sufficiently, by 8 years of effort. Birgu and Sanglea, the two peninsulas that formed the heart of the defensive position, extend into the Grand Harbor from the western shore, Birgu pointing northeast with Fort St. Angelo at its tip, Sanglea pointing in the same direction just south of it with Fort St. Michael at its end. Between the two peninsulas runs a narrow body of water, the Galley Creek, blocked by an iron chain heavy enough to stop boats attempting to pass it. At the base of each peninsula, accessible only by land from the south, the knights had built walls and dug ditches. Between the bases of the two peninsulas, they had laid a pontoon bridge of barrels and planks that allowed reinforcement to pass back and forth in either direction. Standing north of Birgu, on the promontory of Sciberras that separated the Grand Harbor from Marsa-Macedo, Fort St. Elmo guarded the entrance to both harbors. It was newer than St. Angelo, raised in less than a year, its walls thinner than the engineers had wanted, its design sound, but its execution rushed. It commanded the Narrows. It was the fort that Piale Pasha could not leave standing. The outer perimeter of the defensive position had been hardened in the 8 years before the siege. La Valette had ordered buildings demolished south of Birgu and Sanglea to clear the approaches, had contaminated wells, had harvested unripe grain and brought it inside the walls, had burned what could not be carried. The population of the island, who had not been consulted about whether they wished to live inside a siege perimeter, had been incorporated into the defense because they had nowhere else to go, and because La Valette's specific quality of command did not acknowledge the option of civilian non-participation in the defense of the ground civilians were standing on. The Ottoman force that had landed at Marsalak was not simply a large army. It was a system, the most sophisticated military system of the 16th century, with engineering and logistics and artillery and infantry capabilities that no Christian force in the Mediterranean could match in scale. The artillery train that came ashore in the days after the landing included basilisks and demi-basilisks, heavy bronze guns that fired stone balls weighing scores of pounds, guns that had reduced the walls of Constantinople in 1453 and that had been designed and manufactured with the specific purpose of turning fortifications into rubble. The engineering corps included specialists in sapping and mining, the art of digging tunnels under walls and collapsing them, a technique at which the Ottomans were unrivaled in this period. The Janissary Corps, the assault infantry, numbered between 10 and 15,000 men, of the specific quality that 2 centuries of institutional development produced. Soldiers from childhood, trained in nothing but warfare, their loyalty to the Sultan absolute, and their discipline in assault legendary. Against this, 500 knights, 6,000 supporting soldiers, walls of variable thickness, a commander who had thought about this problem for 8 years. To understand what the Janissaries represented as a military force, you have to understand that they were not simply well-trained soldiers. They were soldiers produced by an institution specifically designed to produce men with no loyalty except to the Sultan and no identity except the core. The Devshirme took Christian boys from the Balkans, brought them to the imperial capital, raised them in Islam and in the Ottoman administrative tradition, and graduated them into military service as men whose entire world was the empire. They had no families to go home to, no villages to protect, no individual futures independent of the Corps' collective future. They had each other, and they had the Sultan, and they had the specific institutional culture of 2 centuries of accumulated military wisdom about how to take fortifications that defenders believed could not be taken. They had taken fortifications that defenders believed could not be taken. They had taken Constantinople. They had taken Belgrade. They had taken Rhodes. They had never, in the history of the Corps, encountered a garrison that refused to negotiate terms when the military situation argued for negotiation. They would encounter one now. But they did not know this yet, standing on the beach at Marseilloc in the May morning, their equipment organized and their formations ordered, and their campaign expectations calibrated to the history of their institution, rather than to the specific quality of what was waiting for them on the other end of the island. The war council that La Valette held before the siege began was the war council of a man who has no illusions to manage, only plans to communicate. He assigned Fort St. Elmo its garrison and its commander. He reviewed the signal system between positions. He confirmed the supply state of each position. He issued the orders for the wells outside the defensive perimeter to remain contaminated and the wells inside it to be rationed. He discussed the rotation system that would allow the garrison to rest in shifts, not adequate rest, not the sleep that a man needs to remain effective over a long campaign, but the minimum that prevents complete physical collapse. He told the commanders of St. Elmo explicitly and without softening what he knew and what they needed to know. The fort would receive the first assault. The fort was not thick enough to hold indefinitely, and the fort's purpose was to buy time rather than to survive. He told them this in the language of military precision, not the language of sacrifice and glory, because the language of precision was what the situation required, and what the men who were going to die there deserved. They were not being sent to their deaths in the service of an abstraction. They were being given a specific operational mission with a specific endpoint, and La Valette did not obscure the endpoint. He told them they were the shield. He told them what shields are for. The night before the Ottoman batteries opened fire on St. Elmo, the night of May 23rd, the last quiet night that would visit the fort for 31 days, the garrison held its vigil in the order's tradition. The chaplain said Mass in the fort's small chapel, the candles casting the specific warm light of enclosed spaces against the stone walls, the men kneeling in their armor on the stone floor in the shifts that the chapel's small size required. They were soldiers who had taken religious vows and who were about to demonstrate what those vows meant when the world required them to mean something concrete. They prayed in Latin and in the various languages of the nations that the order drew from, French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and the various Germanic tongues of the German langue. They prayed for the things that soldiers in this specific situation pray for. Not rescue, not survival, but the clarity and the will to do what was required of them in the days ahead. The Ottoman camp to the south prepared differently. The call to prayer went through the camp 5 times in the night, the sound crossing the Maltese landscape with the carrying quality that desert-trained vocal traditions produce, reaching the ears of the men on the walls of Birgu who could hear it, but most of whom could not parse its words. The Janissaries in their tents made their own preparations, the specific preparations of professional soldiers who have done this before, who know what the morning begins and who approach it without the drama that inexperience produces. They checked their equipment. They slept when sleep was available. La Valette did not sleep. Or if he slept, the accounts do not record it, which amounts to the same thing. He walked the walls of Birgu in the darkness, as he would walk them every night and every morning for the next 4 months, accompanied only by a small guard. The harbor below him was dark. The Ottoman fleet filled the anchorage at Marsalak, its lights visible from the walls as a constellation of lanterns distributed across the water. He had seen what was coming for 40 years. It was here. 4 months of fire. The cannon that opened fire on Fort St. Elmo on the morning of May 24th, 1565, was not one cannon. It was 30, then 40, firing in the overlapping sequences that Ottoman artillery doctrine had refined over a century of siege warfare, the shots arriving in a rhythm that was not quite regular, not the metronomic spacing that would allow the mind to habituate to the impact, but was continuous enough that there was never more than a few seconds between one impact and the next. The sound inside a fortification under this kind of bombardment is not the sound of individual cannon shots. It is something that the human auditory system has no natural category for, a sustained physical pressure that arrives through the walls and the floor and the air simultaneously, that makes conversation impossible and thought difficult, that imposes on the men inside it a specific quality of sustained physical distress that is distinct from fear, but that, over hours and days, produces the same biological effects. The limestone dust was everywhere. It accumulated in lungs and in eyes and in the water supply. The defenders of St. Elmo, by the second day of the bombardment, were fighting in a haze of pulverized stone that tasted of chalk and that coated every surface, including the men themselves. The ravelin, the outer defensive work that projected from St. Elmo's southern face, fell on June 3rd, 10 days into the bombardment. It fell to artillery rather than to assault, the Ottoman guns having reduced it to rubble over the previous 10 days, the rubble then being converted by Ottoman engineers into a firing platform from which the main walls of the fort could be engaged at 30 meters rather than 400. At 30 meters, the trajectory of a heavy ball is nearly flat. At 30 meters, every shot is a hit. But the fort did not ask for terms. The garrison repaired the walls in the darkness. They fired back with what they had, the fort's own artillery, the arquebus fire from the walls, the incendiary devices that the order's engineers had prepared. They killed Ottoman soldiers. They damaged Ottoman battery positions. They made the business of reducing Fort St. Elmo more expensive than the Ottoman commanders had planned, at a rate that Dragut, when he arrived on June 2nd and walked the Ottoman forward positions, immediately recognized as unsustainable on the timeline that the campaign required. By mid-June, the walls of St. Elmo were rubble in several sections and makeshift repair in the rest, and the garrison had sent a letter to La Valette across the harbor asking permission to withdraw. The garrison had asked for permission. They had not simply withdrawn, though the boats that could carry them across 800 meters of harbor were available, and the Ottoman night patrols were porous enough to make the crossing possible. They had asked because the order's discipline required asking, and because the men who had survived to write the letter understood, at some level, that the answer was going to be no. La Valette said no. He said it in the specific language of a man who respects the people he is telling no to, not dismissing their assessment of the situation, not pretending the situation was better than they described, but explaining why the no was necessary and what it was for. He told them, "Every day you hold is a day the relief can use." He sent reinforcements, volunteers, men who crossed the harbor in the darkness and climbed into a fort they knew was going to fall, because the order's vow included the specific provision that certain things were done regardless of the personal cost, and this was one of them. The fort fell on June 23rd. The garrison fought in the ruins, some of them seated in chairs at the breach because their wounds prevented standing. The Ottomans who crossed the walls met resistance in every corner and corridor of the fort, until there was no one left to offer it. 6,000 Ottoman soldiers died taking St. Elmo. The fort had held 31 days against 40,000 men. Lala Mustafa Pasha surveyed the rubble and said, "If this small son has cost us so much, what will the father cost?" He looked across the harbor at Fort St. Angelo. He did not have an answer he wanted to contemplate. The second phase began on July 5th, when 112 Ottoman guns opened fire simultaneously on Birgu and Senglia. This number, 112, is worth pausing on. The combined sound of 112 heavy guns firing in overlapping sequence from positions that surrounded the target from multiple angles is not a military event in the conventional sense. It is a geological event, a sustained earthquake of human manufacture, and the men on the walls of Birgu who received it had been watching it being prepared for a week, and still were not ready for what it felt like when it began. The walls held. They held not because the walls were adequate, they were not, but because whenever a section of wall was reduced to rubble, the men behind it built a secondary position of earth and timber and rubble that was less elegant than the limestone it replaced, but was often more effective at absorbing artillery impact. The defenders became expert in the specific engineering of improvised fortification, learning through the first weeks of the bombardment what the Ottoman artillery doctrine prioritized and where the next breach would open and what materials from the surrounding ruins could be most quickly converted into something resembling a defensive position. By noon on July 15th, the water assault on Senglia's western shore had been repulsed. 3,000 Ottoman soldiers and 100 boats had crossed the Grand Harbor before dawn, hit the chain that La Valette had strung across the western shore at the waterline, been forced to disembark in deep water, and been met by the battery that La Valette had positioned specifically to cover the chain. 8 ships sank. 800 soldiers drowned or were killed in the water. The assault on the land side of St. Michael held for 5 hours before the pontoon bridge between Birgu and Senglia allowed reinforcement to arrive at the moment when the line was about to break. The water assault was the moment that most clearly demonstrated the specific quality of La Valette's preparation. Not the dramatic quality of inspired improvisation, but the mundane quality of having thought about this specific problem before it arrived. The chain had been strung weeks before the assault. The hidden battery had been positioned weeks before. The pontoon bridge had been built before the siege began. None of these were responses to the attack. They were preparations for the attack, made by a man who had looked at the geography of his position and the tactical doctrine of his opponent, and had concluded that a water assault on Senglia's western shore was a predictable element of the Ottoman operational plan. He prepared for it. It failed the way prepared defenses fail attacks, completely, at the specific point of failure that preparation identified. Hours after the water assault failed, La Valette received a message from Mustafa Pasha under flag of truce: surrender, and all would be treated well. La Valette had the messenger executed. The execution was not cruelty. It was communication, the specific communication that circumstances sometimes require when words cannot adequately convey what the communicating party means. It meant, there are no terms. We are not going to have that conversation. The July bombardment that continued through the second half of the month was the heaviest sustained artillery fire in the Western Mediterranean since the fall of Constantinople. 112 guns firing in overlapping sequences from positions that surrounded the defensive perimeter from 3 sides, from the Corradino Heights to the southwest, from the position on Scaberas that the Ottoman guns had occupied since the fall of St. Elmo, from the battery on Gallows Point that Dragut had established before his death, and that his successors maintained. The combined weight of iron falling on the walls of Birgu and Senglia each day was measured not in individual shots, but in the cumulative structural damage that accumulates from sustained bombardment. The cracking of limestone, the collapse of sections, the widening of existing cracks into breaches that the defenders filled at night with earth and timber and rubble, and woke the next morning to find that the night's repair had been undone by the morning's guns. But the walls held. Not the original walls, Those were rubble in many sections by late July. What held was the specific will to repair the walls as fast as they were destroyed, to build secondary positions behind the primary walls, to convert the rubble of destroyed structures into the material of new defensive works. The garrison of Birgu in July 1565 was an army of military engineers as much as it was an army of soldiers, the two functions having merged in the specific way that a siege that produces rubble faster than it produces respite forces its defenders to become expert in the improvised use of rubble. August brought the heaviest assaults of the siege. The Ottoman command had learned from June and July that St. Elmo-style attrition against a single point was not the approach that the remaining fortifications required, that the defenders were too few to hold everywhere simultaneously, and that simultaneous pressure on multiple points would eventually find the gap that single-point attacks could not. On August 7th, 8,000 Ottoman soldiers attacked St. Michael and the bastion of Castile at the same time. The assault on St. Michael was the attack that had been expected. The peninsula was the weaker of the two main defensive positions, its walls more damaged, its garrison more depleted by 3 months of combat and the specific attrition of men who never fully rest and never fully eat. But the simultaneous attack on the bastion of Castile was the attack that came closest to ending the siege, because the bastion of Castile was on the Birgu Peninsula, and the Birgu Peninsula was where the Order's headquarters and the hospital and the magazine and Fort St. Angelo were located, and if the bastion fell, the Ottoman forces were inside the main position. The defenders who held the bastion of Castile on August 7th were few enough that the accounts describe them in terms that suggest the gap between what they were defending and what they had available to defend it with had never been more stark. They were fighting on a wall that was rubble against 8,000 fresh attackers with perhaps a few hundred men. They held because of the specific discipline that the Order's training produced, and because of the specific weight of La Valette's presence behind them. And then they held because of the Medina cavalry that attacked the Ottoman camp at the crucial moment. And then they did not hold any more, and the battle was still going when it was supposed to be over. The bastion of Castile was close to falling when La Valette made his appearance there. Not to observe. He climbed the breach with the knights he had been holding in reserve, the last reserve, the final human resource of the defense, and fought in the rubble with the men who were still standing. He was 69 years old. He had a leg wound from a bullet that had struck him earlier in the siege that he had not mentioned to anyone except the surgeon who dressed it. He was in the breach. The fighting at the bastion of Castile on August 7th lasted 11 hours. The Ottoman army that withdrew at the end of it withdrew because a Maltese cavalry patrol had attacked the virtually empty Ottoman camp and shouted Victoria and Socorro, victory and relief. And the cry had reached the Ottoman assault parties on the walls and been taken for the arrival of the Spanish relief force, and the assault collapsed from the inside of itself, the soldiers turning and running for a camp that was under attack by 100 horsemen rather than an army. When Mustafa Pasha found out it was 100 horsemen, he swore to give no quarter. He was enraged in the specific way that commanders become enraged when they realize that the battle they thought they had won has escaped them through the specific cruelty of accident and miscommunication. He planned the final assault for late August, the largest and most comprehensive attack of the campaign. The late August assaults destroyed the walls in multiple additional sections and produced fighting in the streets of Birgu that the accounts describe with the specific language people use when they have seen something they cannot quite believe. Not in the formal positions, in the streets, in the buildings, hand to hand in the rubble of a city that had been under continuous bombardment for 3 months. The defenders held. They held in the specific way that people who have been doing something for 3 months have learned to do it. Not with the energy of the beginning, but with the worn, habituated, automatic persistence of men for whom holding the line has become simply what they do, the background state of existence from which deviation requires more will than they have available. On September 7th, the Ottoman camp began dismantling. The guard on the walls of Birgu saw it and didn't believe it at first. The movement in the camp that had surrounded them for 4 months, the change in the camp's rhythm that meant something fundamental had shifted. Then the sails appeared on the northern horizon. Don Garcia de Toledo's relief force, 8,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers, was landing at Melilla Bay. The relief that the garrison felt was not the relief of rescue. They were already saved. They had been saving themselves for 4 months. The relief was of a different, more specific kind. The proof that the world they had been defending still existed, that the effort had not been made in absolute isolation, that someone had come. 8,000 men. Not the army of tens of thousands that La Valette had been requesting. 8,000. They were enough. Mustafa Pasha turned his army around. His scouts reported that the relief force was smaller than the rumors. He marched north to destroy it before it could reinforce the garrison. At St. Paul's Bay on September 11th, the rested relief force on its ridge met the exhausted Ottoman army that had spent 4 months in the killing heat of Malta's summer, and the Ottoman army broke. Broke in the way that exhausted, depleted forces break when they meet fresh opponents. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but with the specific finality of men who have used everything they had. September 12th. The Ottoman fleet sailed east. What remained? The harbor of Birgu on September 14, 1565, was the harbor of a place that had survived something it was not supposed to survive. Don Garcia de Toledo came ashore to meet La Valette, bringing food and surgeons and supplies, and the material proof that the Spanish Empire had, eventually, honored its obligation. La Valette received him with the specific courtesy of a man who has many things he could say, and who chooses to say only what is necessary. He thanked Don Garcia. He noted the date of the relief's arrival against the date of Fort St. Elmo's fall. He did not elaborate. The garrison that had begun May with approximately 9,000 effective fighters numbered fewer than 2,000 when the relief landed. More than 7,000 were dead or permanently incapacitated. Of the 500 knights who had been on Malta when the siege began, approximately 250 were dead. The fortifications were rubble, with patches of original wall surviving in the sections that had received less concentrated fire. The hospitals were full. The wells that had not been contaminated before the siege were strained. The island smelled of 4 months of combat and summer heat, and the specific aftermath that every extended siege produces. The Ottoman losses were the count that every account of the siege reaches for, because the numbers are so extreme as to require repetition. 25,000 dead, by the most commonly cited estimate, with additional thousands wounded and captured. Against a garrison that had never exceeded 9,000 and that ended the siege at 2,000. The ratio of losses, Ottoman to Christian, makes the Great Siege of Malta one of the most expensive failures of military force in the history of siege warfare. The bodies of the dead were still in the trenches and at the walls when the fleet sailed. The Ottoman dead were too numerous and too scattered for the departing army to collect, and the Maltese were too few and too exhausted to bury them promptly. They remained in the Maltese autumn, on the ground where they had fallen, the specific archaeological layer of the siege's cost that the subsequent reconstruction covered over. La Valette wrote to Philip II, to the Pope, to Don Garcia, in the weeks after the relief. The letters are the letters of a man in the reporting phase, precise, organized, deliberately restrained in their emotional register. He noted the casualties. He requested resources for reconstruction. He acknowledged the assistance that had been provided. He noted, with a precision that required no elaboration, the date of the relief's arrival and the date of Fort St. Elmo's fall. 67 days between the two. He trusted the reader to perform the arithmetic that the dates required. The empty ground north of the Grand Harbor, where the Ottoman siege lines had been, returned to Maltese weather in the autumn weeks after the fleet's departure. The trenches remained, raw cuts in the limestone, too much work to fill immediately, left as the geological record of 4 months of Ottoman engineering effort, directed at a position that held. The abandoned equipment lay where it had been left in the haste of departure. The Maltese farmers who came back to their fields in October found the marks of the siege in the ground they were plowing, the disturbed earth that the Ottoman engineering corps had spent 4 months modifying. The island had held. The cost was irreplaceable. The gain was everything. The world that the siege made. La Valette began building Valletta on March 28, 1566. He built it on the promontory of Scaberras, on the ground where the Ottoman batteries had stood, above the ruins of Fort St. Elmo, and he built it as the answer to the question that the siege had answered in rubble and blood. What does Malta need to hold against this? The answer was thicker walls, a better planned city, the institutional knowledge of what the summer of 1565 had required, translated into limestone and military architecture. He named it after himself. He was right to. The immediate strategic consequences of the siege were the consequences of a preserved position and a shattered initiative. The Ottoman fleet that returned to Constantinople in September 1565 returned as a fleet that had failed, in the specific public way that the world had been watching for 4 months, and that could not be obscured by administrative explanation. Suleiman received the news at Edirne, the news that the island had not been taken, that 25,000 soldiers were dead, that the Knights of Malta were still on their island, and that the Mediterranean was not fully Ottoman from end to end. He died the following year, on campaign in Hungary, without having resolved the Malta question. His successors would not return to the Western Mediterranean in force until Lepanto in 1571, where the Ottoman fleet met the Holy League and was destroyed. Lepanto is sometimes treated as the decisive victory that Tours and Malta are also sometimes treated as, the moment when the tide turned permanently. In reality, all 3 of these engagements are part of the same story, the story of the specific boundary at which the Ottoman Empire's westward expansion found what it could not overcome. Malta was not that boundary by itself, but it was the first clear evidence that such a boundary existed, that the expansion that had been continuous for 100 years was not infinite, that the right combination of preparation and will and geography could stop it. For Catholic Europe, the siege's outcome was received as confirmation of a divine purpose that the preceding months of terror had made uncertain. The Pope declared thanksgiving. The courts that had been watching with the specific anxiety of people who understood what an Ottoman Malta would mean for their own coastlines exhaled in a collective relief that found expression in masses and in celebrations, and in the particular literary industry of commemorative verse that 16th-century courts produced for occasions of this magnitude. Voltaire, writing 2 centuries later, called the Great Siege of Malta one of the greatest events of the 16th century. He was not wrong. For the Order of St. John, the siege's outcome was the validation of everything the Order's 400-year existence had been building toward. Not the validation of the crusading ideology in the abstract theological sense, but the validation of the specific institutional design that turned religious vows into military capability. The order had been founded to defend pilgrims and to fight the enemies of Christendom, and it had been doing both, with varying effectiveness, since the 11th century. At Malta, in 1565, it demonstrated that the military religious order tradition, which was the specific combination of monastic discipline and martial skill that the 11th century had invented, and that the 16th century occasionally questioned, could produce soldiers capable of something that purely secular military institutions had difficulty producing. Men for whom the calculation of personal survival was subordinate to the requirement of the vow. This is what the 500 knights actually were. Not simply brave men. The 16th century had no shortage of brave men. Not simply skilled soldiers. The Janissaries were more skilled in most technical senses. They were men for whom the specific question that determines the outcome of a siege, at what point does the cost exceed the acceptable limit and surrender become the rational choice, had a different answer than it had for other soldiers. For the knights, The question had been answered before the siege began, answered by the vow they had taken, and the institution they served, and the specific calculation that La Valette had made and communicated to them. The acceptable limit was death. The acceptable limit was the last man standing in the rubble. And because the Ottomans could not calibrate their attacks to the actual limit, could only observe, as week succeeded week and assault succeeded assault, that the limit had not yet been reached, the defensive position held longer than any calculation based on numbers alone would have predicted. Centuries later, Valette is the capital of the Republic of Malta, a small island nation of 500,000 people in the center of the Mediterranean. The city that La Valette built on the ruins of the Ottoman batteries is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its Baroque architecture and its fortifications intact enough that the geometry of the city's defense is still legible to anyone who walks its streets. Fort St. Elmo, rebuilt after the siege, on stronger and thicker foundations than the original, stands at the tip of the Shibera's promontory and houses a war museum. The Grand Harbor receives cruise ships. The fortifications of Birgu, called Vittoriosa now, the victorious one, the name it received after the siege, still rise from the harbor's edge. The Maltese people who lived through the siege and who fought in it are represented in that name, Vittoriosa. Birgu became Vittoriosa because the Maltese, who had never particularly loved the knights who governed their island, fought beside them anyway. In the specific way of people who understand that the alternative to their current rulers is not freedom, but conquest of a different and more final kind. The island of Gozo's total population had been enslaved in a single day in 1551. The Maltese who took up arms in 1565 did not need to be told what was at stake. They could see it from 1551. The limestone that the Ottoman artillery spent 4 months trying to reduce to rubble is still there. It has been repaired and reinforced and built upon over 4.5 centuries, but the underlying stone is the same stone, and the harbor it guards is the same harbor. And the question that the siege asked, what happens when 500 knights face off against 40,000 Ottomans, has its answer written in that stone. They held. They held for 4 months against 40,000 with 500. They held through the fall of St. Elmo and the water assault and the July bombardment and the August assaults and the near collapse at the bastion of Castile. They held because La Valette had prepared them to hold, and because the order's vow had given them a specific relationship with their own mortality that conventional military calculation could not model. They held because the Maltese people fought beside them, because the Spanish relief eventually came, because the Ottoman command made errors that a better prepared operation would not have made. They held because some questions only have one answer, and the answer was already decided before the fleet came over the horizon. The limestone is still there. The harbor is still there. The walls are still standing. 500 knights against 40,000 Ottomans. They held.